At exactly 3:17 a.m. on this cold February morning, Shadow began his ritual once again. The sleek bobcat's golden eyes gleamed in the nursery's dim light as he positioned himself beside 4-month-old Emma's crib, releasing a low, persistent yowl that cut through the silence like a blade. Sarah Mitchell jolted awake in the master bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. 30 nights. 30 consecutive nights of this torment. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bed sheets, every muscle in her body screaming from exhaustion. "Not again," she whispered, tears already forming. Tom stirred beside her, his weathered face etched with defeat. Tomorrow morning, the wildlife sanctuary truck would arrive. After 3 years of loving shadow-like family, they had finally surrendered. They had no idea this would be the last night Shadow would need to wake them. In the nursery, Shadow's cries grew more desperate, more urgent. Something was terribly wrong, and he was running out of time to save them all. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sarah Mitchell had always believed in second chances, perhaps because she'd needed so many herself. At 32, the former registered nurse carried the quiet strength of someone who'd witnessed both life's miracles and its cruelties during her years in the pediatric ICU. Her auburn hair, now perpetually pulled back in a messy bun, framed a face that showed the toll of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Tom Mitchell, her husband of 7 years, possessed the patient soul of a man who'd dedicated his life to protecting North Carolina's wildlife. At 35, his job as a conservation officer had taught him that nature rarely followed human expectations, yet he'd never encountered anything quite like Shadow. The bobcat had wandered into their lives 3 years ago, a 6-week-old kitten found whimpering beside his mother's lifeless body after illegal hunters had used toxic gas to flush animals from their mountain den. Tom had discovered the tiny survivor during a routine patrol, his golden eyes already displaying the fierce intelligence that would later captivate the Mitchell family. Most wildlife rescues ended with rehabilitation and release, but Shadow defied every protocol. The kitten had bonded so intensely with Tom during his recovery that 3 separate release attempts failed. Each time, Shadow returned to their remote cabin, sitting patiently on the porch until Tom's heart overruled his professional training. Their mountain home in the Blue Ridge foothills had always been a sanctuary for wounded creatures, but Shadow became something more: family. The special permits required extensive documentation, home inspections, and proof of adequate facilities. But Tom's reputation and Sarah's medical background helped secure approval for keeping the bobcat. When Emma arrived 4 months ago after years of fertility struggles, Shadow's reaction had been nothing short of miraculous. The typically territorial animal had approached the newborn with reverent curiosity, gently sniffing her tiny hands before settling beside the crib like a self-appointed guardian. Those first months had been blissful. Shadow seemed to understand Emma's needs instinctively, alerting them to wet diapers and feeding times with soft chirps. Then came the night that shattered their peaceful existence. February 15th, exactly 1 month ago, Shadow had begun his inexplicable ritual. Every night at precisely 3:17 a.m. he would position himself beside Emma's crib and yowl with increasing urgency until the entire household was awake. No amount of coaxing, scolding, or physical removal could deter him. The behavior was so unlike the gentle, intuitive companion. They'd known that Sarah began to wonder if something fundamental had changed in Shadow's relationship with their daughter. Now, as Tom's mother Eleanor prepared to arrive from Charlotte with her firm opinions about wild animals and innocent babies, and Dr. Patricia Whitman's final assessment loomed tomorrow, Sarah felt the weight of an impossible choice crushing down upon her exhausted shoulders. The first incident happened on February 15th, a Tuesday night that would forever divide their lives into before and after. Sarah had just settled Emma down for what she hoped would be a solid 6-hour stretch of sleep. The baby had been fussy all day, and Sarah's body ached with the bone-deep exhaustion that only new mothers understand. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Shadow's voice pierced the silence. Not his usual soft chirp or contented purr, but a sharp, insistent yowl that seemed to echo through the cabin's wooden walls. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart immediately racing with that primal fear every parent knows. Something was wrong with the baby. She stumbled down the hallway, Tom close behind, to find Shadow positioned beside Emma's crib like a sentry. His golden eyes were fixed on the sleeping infant, and he was vocalizing with an urgency Sarah had never heard before. Emma remained peaceful, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, but Shadow refused to be calmed. "What's wrong, boy?" Tom whispered, reaching out to stroke Shadow's spotted fur. The bobcat flinched away, something he'd never done before, and continued his distressed calling. They tried everything that night. Tom carried Shadow to the living room, but he immediately returned to the nursery. Sarah checked Emma's diaper, took her temperature, even nursed her, though the baby showed no signs of distress. Nothing worked. Shadow's cries continued until dawn, when he finally settled down as if nothing had happened. "Maybe he's getting territorial about the baby," Sarah suggested over coffee the next morning, her hands shaking from caffeine and sleep deprivation. Some animals get possessive when they think their territory is threatened. Tom frowned, watching Shadow through the kitchen window as the bobcat lounged peacefully in his favorite sunny spot. But he's been perfect with Emma for 4 months. Why would that change overnight? The second night brought the same torment. And 3:17 a.m. exactly, and Shadow's urgent vocalizations began again. This time, Tom tried sleeping in the nursery to observe Shadow's behavior more closely. The bobcat approached the crib with obvious distress, sniffing the air repeatedly and pawing gently at the crib's side rails. His body language spoke of anxiety, not aggression, but his cries were becoming more frantic with each passing minute. By the end of the first week, Sarah felt like she was losing her mind. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her hands trembled constantly from exhaustion. Emma, surprisingly, seemed unaffected by the nightly disruptions, often sleeping through Shadow's loudest episodes, but Sarah and Tom were deteriorating rapidly. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah confessed to Tom on the 7th night, tears streaming down her face as Shadow's cries echoed from the nursery. "I love him, you know I do, but I can't function like this. What if I make a mistake with Emma? What if I'm so tired that I miss something important?" Tom's face reflected her anguish. As a wildlife officer, he understood animal behavior better than most, but Shadow's actions defied every explanation he could devise. The bobcat wasn't showing aggression toward Emma, quite the opposite. He seemed desperate to protect her from something, but from what? They tried physical barriers first. Tom installed a baby gate at the nursery entrance, but Shadow simply leaped over it with feline grace. They moved Emma's crib to their bedroom, but Shadow followed, his cries becoming even more urgent in the confined space. They even attempted to keep Shadow outside during nighttime hours, but his yowling from the porch was so heartbreaking and persistent that neighbors 2 miles away called to complain. The financial strain began during the second week. Tom, desperate to understand Shadow's behavior, started working double shifts to pay for veterinary consultations. 3 different veterinarians examined Shadow thoroughly, running blood tests and behavioral assessments, but each declared the bobcat physically healthy. The bills mounted quickly: $400 for the initial emergency consultation, $600 for comprehensive blood work, another $300 for a specialist's behavioral evaluation. Sarah, meanwhile, was supposed to return to her nursing position at the regional hospital after her maternity leave ended. But how could she work 12-hour shifts when she was barely getting 2 hours of consecutive sleep? Her supervisor, initially sympathetic, began expressing concerns about Sarah's reliability. "I need to know if you're coming back, Sarah," Dr. Martinez had said during their phone call. "I can't hold your position indefinitely, and frankly, you don't sound ready to handle patient care responsibilities." The comment stung because it was true. Sarah had nearly put Emma's pajamas on backwards the night before, and she'd caught herself pouring orange juice into Emma's bottle instead of formula. Sleep deprivation was making her dangerous to herself and her family. By the third week, their relationship began showing cracks. Tom, exhausted and frustrated by his inability to solve the problem, became short-tempered and withdrawn. Sarah, overwhelmed by the constant sleep interruption and mounting pressure, found herself snapping at Tom over minor issues. Their conversations devolved into terse exchanges about logistics. Who would handle the next night shift? Who would call the next animal expert? Who would figure out how to pay the mounting bills? "Maybe we need to consider finding Shadow a new home," Sarah suggested tentatively one morning, immediately regretting the words when she saw Tom's face crumble. "He's not just a pet, Sarah. He's family. He chose us, remember? After everything he's been through, after the trust he's placed in us, how can we abandon him?" But Sarah's resolve was weakening. Emma deserved parents who were alert and present, not zombies stumbling through each day in a fog of exhaustion. The baby was beginning to show signs of the disruption, too. She'd become fussier during the day, her eating schedule disrupted, her normal development milestones slightly delayed. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal night in the 4th week. Shadow's cries had been more persistent than ever, lasting nearly 3 hours. Sarah had tried everything: feeding Emma, changing her, rocking her, even playing soft music. Nothing calmed Shadow's distress. When dawn finally broke and Shadow settled into his usual peaceful demeanor, Sarah found herself sobbing uncontrollably in the kitchen. "I can't be the mother Emma needs like this," she whispered to Tom, her voice broken. "I love Shadow, but I love our daughter more." Something has to give. That's when Tom made the call that would change everything. Dr. Patricia Whitman, a renowned animal behaviorist from the University of North Carolina, specialized in exotic pet behavioral issues. Her consultation fee was steep, $500 for an initial assessment. But Tom was desperate for answers. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, and somehow that small step toward resolution allowed them to endure a few more nights of torment. But deep down, both Sarah and Tom suspected they already knew what Dr. Whitman would recommend. Shadow's behavior was escalating, not improving, and their family couldn't survive much longer under these conditions. As they prepared for the expert's visit, neither could shake the feeling that they were about to cross a point of no return. The bobcat who had brought such joy and wonder into their lives was now threatening to tear their family apart, and they had no idea why. Dr. Patricia Whitman arrived on a crisp March morning, her silver sedan crunching over the gravel driveway with an authority that made Sarah's stomach clench. The woman who emerged was exactly what Sarah had expected: tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal wool coat, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than the Mitchells spent on groceries in 2 months. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes surveyed the rustic cabin with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Mitchell, I presume," Dr. Whitman said, extending a manicured hand. Her grip was firm but cold, and Sarah noticed how the woman's gaze immediately swept past her toward the house, as if cataloging evidence for a case she'd already decided. Tom emerged from the barn where he'd been securing Shadow during the consultation, his work boots muddy and his flannel shirt wrinkled from the morning chores. The contrast between his weathered, honest appearance and Doc Whitman's polished professionalism couldn't have been starker. "Dr. Whitman, thank you for coming," Tom said, wiping his hands on his jeans before offering one to their visitor. "I know it's a long drive from Chapel Hill." "Indeed it is," she replied curtly, barely touching his hand. "Shall we begin? I have another appointment in Asheville this afternoon." Inside the cabin, Dr. Whitman's examination was thorough and methodical. She inspected every room, taking notes on a tablet and occasionally photographing areas with a small digital camera. Her questions were rapid-fire and clinical. How long had they owned the Bobcat? What were his vaccination records? Had there been any incidents of aggression? What was their experience with exotic animals? Sarah found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable as Dr. Whitman's questions became more pointed. "And you, Mrs. Mitchell, what is your educational background with large predators?" "I'm a registered nurse," Sarah replied, feeling inadequate. "I worked pediatric ICU before Emma was born." Dr. Whitman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Pediatric nursing. Interesting. And you felt qualified to assess the safety of keeping a wild predator around an infant?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Tom stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Shadow has never shown any aggression toward Emma or anyone else. He's been nothing but protective." "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Whitman interrupted, "anthropomorphizing animal behavior is one of the most dangerous mistakes pet owners make. What you interpret as protection could very well be territorial possessiveness. The fact that this behavior began shortly after your daughter's birth is highly significant." She spent an hour observing Shadow through the window, watching as the Bobcat lounged peacefully in the afternoon sun. To Sarah's eyes, he looked like the same gentle creature who had comforted her through morning sickness, who had sat vigil beside her hospital bed when Emma was born. But Dr. Whitman saw something different. "Classic signs of stress-induced behavioral deviation," she murmured, making notes. "Notice the increased grooming behavior, the hypervigilance, the way he positions himself to maintain visual contact with the house. This animal is experiencing significant psychological distress." "But he's only agitated at night," Tom protested. "During the day, he's perfectly normal." Dr. Whitman turned to face them both, her expression grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I need to be very direct with you. What you're describing, the precise timing, the escalating intensity, the resistance to behavioral modification, these are clear indicators of a predator whose instincts are overriding his socialization. In my professional opinion, this Bobcat views your infant as either competition for resources or, more troubling, as potential prey." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. Shadow loves Emma. You should see how gentle he is with her." "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Whitman's voice carried the weight of academic authority, "I have 30 years of experience in exotic animal behavior. I've published over 40 peer-reviewed papers on predator-prey relationships in domestic settings. What you're experiencing is not uncommon. Large cats, even those raised from infancy, retain powerful hunting instincts that can be triggered by the presence of small, vulnerable creatures." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Sarah reached for Tom's hand, finding it as cold as her own. "What are you saying exactly?" Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that this animal poses a significant and escalating threat to your family. The nocturnal vocalizations, the persistent focus on the infant, the resistance to deterrence. These behaviors will likely intensify until the animal acts on his instincts. I've seen this pattern before, and it rarely ends well." Dr. Whitman opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder, thick with official-looking documents. I'm recommending immediate removal of the animal from your home environment. I have contacts at several excellent wildlife sanctuaries that can provide appropriate care for a bobcat with behavioral issues. Behavioral issues? Tom's voice rose dangerously. A month ago, you would have called him a model example of successful wildlife rehabilitation. A month ago, the environmental factors were different, Dr. Whitman replied coolly. The introduction of an infant has triggered primitive responses that override years of conditioning. This is basic animal psychology, Mr. Mitchell. Sarah stared at the documents in Dr. Whitman's hands. Surrender forms, liability waivers, transport authorizations, official papers that would erase 3 years of love and trust with a few signatures. How long do we have? She heard herself ask. Given the escalating nature of the behavior, I would recommend removal within 48 hours. The longer you wait, the more dangerous the situation becomes. Dr. Whitman's tone softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the devastation on their faces. I understand this is difficult. Many people form emotional attachments to wild animals, but your responsibility now is to your child. After Dr. Whitman left, promising to arrange transport within 2 days, Sarah and Tom sat in their kitchen in stunned silence. The surrender forms lay spread across the worn wooden table like evidence of their failure. 30 years of experience, Tom said finally, his voice hollow. 40 published papers. How do I argue with that? Sarah stared out the window where Shadow was grooming himself in the fading afternoon light, looking for all the world like an oversized house cat enjoying the sunshine. Maybe she's right. Maybe we've been so focused on what we want to see that we've missed what's really happening. That evening, Tom called his mother in Charlotte. Eleanor Mitchell, at 68, was a woman who had raised 5 children through everything from farm accidents to teenage rebellions. Her voice carried the authority of experience when she announced she would arrive the next morning. I should have come sooner, Eleanor said, her tone making it clear she blamed herself for not intervening earlier. I knew that animal was too wild for a household with a baby, but I hoped y'all would come to your senses on your own. The conversation that followed was painful. Eleanor's love for her son was unquestionable, but her fear for her granddaughter's safety overrode any sentiment about Shadow. She had grown up in a time when wild animals stayed wild, and the idea of keeping a bobcat as a pet, especially around an infant, seemed like dangerous foolishness. Your daddy used to say that love without wisdom is just another word for selfishness, Eleanor told Tom. You love that cat, I know you do. But loving something means doing what's best for it, even when it breaks your heart. As night approached and Shadow began showing signs of his usual pre-ritual restlessness, Sarah and Tom faced the reality that tomorrow would likely be their last day as a family of 4. The experts' diagnosis had been unequivocal. The family pressure was mounting, and their own exhaustion was making rational thought nearly impossible. Neither of them slept that night, knowing that Shadow's cries would begin again at 3:17 a.m., and that this time they would be listening with the knowledge that each call might be evidence of the threat their beloved companion had supposedly become. Eleanor Mitchell arrived at dawn the next morning, her ancient Ford pickup truck rattling up the mountain road like a herald of judgment. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Tom's mother emerged from the cab, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her floral dress pressed and proper even for a crisis intervention. At 68, Eleanor carried herself with the rigid dignity of a woman who had buried a husband, raised 5 children, and survived the Great Recession without asking anyone for help. "Sarah, honey," Eleanor said, embracing her daughter-in-law with the fierce protectiveness of a grandmother whose grandbaby was in danger. "You look terrible. When's the last time you had a proper night's sleep?" The question hit harder than any accusation. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd slept more than 2 consecutive hours. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with the trembling hands of someone operating on pure adrenaline and maternal desperation. Eleanor's assessment of the situation was swift and unforgiving. She listened to Tom's explanation of Dr. Whitman's findings with the skeptical attention of someone who had raised children when expert opinions were luxuries most families couldn't afford. But when Tom finished describing the behaviorist's recommendations, Eleanor's face hardened into a mask of unwavering resolve. "That animal has to go," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of generations of practical mountain wisdom. "I don't care how much you love him, Thomas. Love doesn't protect babies from wild instincts." The first 12 hours of Eleanor's visit became a battlefield of family loyalty versus survival instinct. Tom, desperate to defend Shadow, recounted every gentle moment, every protective gesture, every sign of the deep bond between the bobcat and their family. He spoke of Shadow's intelligence, his capacity for affection, his remarkable adaptation to domestic life. Eleanor listened with the patience of a woman who had heard every possible argument for keeping pets that sensible people knew were dangerous. She had grown up on a farm where decisions about animals were made with heads, not hearts, where sentimentality could cost lives. "Your daddy once brought home a baby fox," she told Tom, settling into the rocking chair that had belonged to 3 generations of Mitchell women. "Cutest little thing you ever saw. Followed him around like a puppy, slept at the foot of our bed, gentle as could be, until the day it bit your sister's hand clean through when she tried to take away its food bowl. Took 8 stitches and a rabies series to fix that mistake." The parallel stung because Tom couldn't deny its validity. Wild animals, no matter how well socialized, carried genetic programming that domestication couldn't erase. Eleanor's stories were filled with similar cautionary tales: the tame hawk that attacked a neighbor's child, the bottle-raised deer that turned aggressive during rutting season, the rescued bear cub that mauled its caretaker when it reached maturity. "But Shadow's different," Sarah found herself arguing, even as doubt crept into her voice. "He's never shown any aggression. Even now, he's not trying to hurt Emma. He's just making noise." Eleanor's laugh was bitter with experience. "Honey, that's exactly what every family says, right up until the moment their precious pet follows its nature instead of its training. You think that cat's behavior change is random. You think 30 years of expert opinion doesn't mean anything?" The financial argument proved even more devastating than the emotional one. Eleanor, who had managed a household budget through decades of economic uncertainty, quickly calculated the mounting costs of their situation. Tom's overtime wages barely covered the veterinary bills and expert consultations. Sarah's inability to return to work was costing them her full nursing salary, nearly $3,000 per month in lost income. The sleep deprivation was affecting Tom's job performance, putting his conservation officer position at risk. "You can't afford to keep fighting this," Eleanor said bluntly, spreading their bills across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial. "Even if that animal never hurts anyone, this situation is destroying your family financially. How long before Tom makes a mistake at work because he's too tired to think straight? How long before you lose the house because you can't make the mortgage payments?" The questions hung in the air like accusations because they reflected fears that Sarah and Tom had been too exhausted to fully confront. Their savings account, modest to begin with, had been depleted by veterinary bills and lost wages. The mortgage payment was due in 10 days, and they were still $800 short. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began stopping by, ostensibly to check on the family but clearly driven by curiosity about the dramatic events they'd been hearing about. The Hendersons, from the next mountain over, mentioned that their own children were afraid to play outside, worried about the dangerous wild animal that was terrorizing the Mitchell baby. Old Pete McCready, who lived closest to their property line, complained that Shadow's nightly vocalizations were disturbing his cattle, causing his milk cows to produce less. "It's not just about your family anymore," Eleanor pointed out with devastating accuracy. "Your neighbors are scared. Their children are scared. Property values around here will drop if word gets out that there's an unpredictable bobcat on the loose." The community pressure intensified when Sheriff Bob Coleman arrived in his patrol car just before dinner. Sarah's heart sank as she watched the lawman emerge, his expression grim and official. She had known Bob since high school. He'd been Tom's best man at their wedding, but today he wore the face of duty rather than friendship. "Tom, Sarah." Bob nodded respectfully to Eleanor before focusing on the younger couple. "I hate to be here on official business, but I've got 3 formal complaints about noise disturbances and animal control called asking about permits and safety protocols. I need to know what your plans are for resolving this situation." The implicit threat was clear. If the family couldn't solve the problem voluntarily, legal intervention would follow. Tom's special permit to keep Shadow was contingent on maintaining peaceful coexistence with the community. Multiple noise complaints could trigger a mandatory review that might result in immediate confiscation. "We've got a transport arranged for tomorrow morning," Tom said quietly, the words seeming to tear something vital from his chest. "Dr. Whitman connected us with a sanctuary in Tennessee that specializes in behavioral rehabilitation." Bob's relief was visible. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Tom. I know how much that cat means to you both, but with a baby in the house—" He shrugged helplessly, a gesture that spoke volumes about the impossible nature of their situation. That evening, as the family faced their final night with Shadow, the weight of accumulated pressure threatened to crush what remained of their resistance. Eleanor had prepared Tom's favorite dinner: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans fresh from her own garden, but no one had much appetite. Emma, perhaps sensing the tension, had been fussy all day, crying at intervals that seemed to echo Shadow's nightly distress. Dr. Whitman called twice to confirm transport arrangements. The sanctuary truck would arrive at 8 a.m. sharp. They would need Shadow sedated and crated for the 6-hour drive to his new home. The behaviorist's voice carried professional satisfaction as she detailed the specialized facility where Shadow would live. Spacious enclosures, expert care, other bobcats for companionship. "You're making the right choice," Dr. Whitman assured them. "This facility has excellent success rates for rehabilitating animals with behavioral issues. In time, Shadow will be much happier in an environment suited to his natural instincts." After the call, Tom sat on the porch where Shadow often joined him for evening conversations. The bobcat approached cautiously, as if sensing the emotional turmoil radiating from his human. When Shadow rubbed against Tom's legs with his usual affection, the conservation officer broke down completely, burying his face in the animal's spotted fur. "I'm sorry, buddy," Tom whispered, his voice cracking. "I failed you. I should have understood what you were trying to tell us, should have found another way. But I can't lose my family to save you, and I can't risk Emma's safety based on hope and wishful thinking." Shadow purred softly, the rumbling vibration a comfort that Tom would remember for the rest of his life. In just a few hours, those golden eyes would close in chemically induced sleep, and when they opened again, Shadow would be in a cage, surrounded by strangers, wondering why the family he had trusted and protected had abandoned him. Inside the house, Sarah packed Shadow's favorite toys and blankets, items that might provide some comfort during his transition. Her tears fell steadily as she folded the small quilt Eleanor had made for Shadow's first Christmas with them, embroidered with his name in careful stitches that represented hours of grudging affection from a woman who was now advocating for his removal. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They were destroying their family to save it, breaking Tom's heart to protect Emma's life, choosing rational fear over irrational love. As 3:17 a.m. approached, they all waited with sick anticipation for Shadow's final performance, the last chapter in a story that had begun with rescue and hope, but was ending in separation and sorrow. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Shadow's voice shattered the tense silence that had settled over the Mitchell household like a burial shroud. But this time, his cries carried a desperate urgency that made Sarah's blood run cold. The sound wasn't the familiar yowling they had endured for 30 nights. It was something primal and terrifying, a keening wail that spoke of mortal danger. Tom bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the nursery, Shadow's vocalizations escalated to a pitch they had never heard before, interspersed with frantic scratching at the hardwood floor. Eleanor, who had been sleeping in the guest room, appeared in the hallway, wearing her cotton nightgown, her face pale with alarm. "Sweet Lord," she whispered, clutching her robe around her thin frame. "What's gotten into that animal?" Sarah rushed to Emma's crib, expecting to find their daughter terrified by the commotion, but the baby slept peacefully, despite the cacophony. Shadow paced frantically around the nursery, his golden eyes wild with an emotion that looked disturbingly like panic. When Tom entered the room, the Bobcat immediately rushed to him, then toward the door, then back again, clearly trying to communicate something urgent. "He wants us to follow him," Tom said, his voice barely audible over Shadow's continued cries. "Look at his body language. He's not agitated about Emma. He's trying to lead us somewhere." Eleanor scoffed from the doorway. "Thomas, don't start anthropomorphizing again. Dr. Whitman warned us about that. The animal is having some kind of breakdown because he senses the changes coming." But Shadow's behavior was unlike anything they had witnessed during the previous month. Instead of focusing on Emma's crib, he kept moving toward the hallway, looking back at them expectantly. When Tom didn't follow, Shadow returned and actually grabbed Tom's pajama sleeve gently between his teeth, tugging with increasing desperation. "He's never done that before," Sarah whispered, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of Shadow's obvious distress. "Tom, what if—" "What if what?" Eleanor's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "What if we ignore 30 years of expert opinion because an animal is acting strange on his last night here?" "Sarah, honey, you're so tired you're not thinking clearly." Tom found himself torn between rational thought and instinct. Every expert had confirmed that Shadow's behavior was dangerous, that his fixation on Emma represented a threat that would only escalate. But the Bobcat's current actions seemed less focused on the baby and more directed toward something else entirely. Shadow's frustration mounted when his humans failed to understand his message. He began pacing more rapidly, his cries becoming sharper and more insistent. At one point, he actually left the nursery entirely, padding down the hallway toward the main living area before returning to check if anyone was following. "Maybe we should see what he wants," Tom suggested tentatively, just to rule out any possibility that— "Absolutely not," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Thomas, tomorrow morning that animal is leaving this house for good. Don't make this harder on yourself by inventing reasons to believe he's trying to help. Sometimes animals act erratically when they sense major changes coming. It doesn't mean anything beyond stress and confusion." The standoff continued for nearly an hour. Shadow's desperation grew more pronounced with each passing minute, his vocalizations reaching levels that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's wooden framework. He would approach each family member in turn, making urgent chirping sounds and looking toward the hallway, but his attempts at communication were met with tired confusion and mounting frustration. Sarah, operating on barely 2 hours of sleep, felt her sanity fraying at the edges. The combination of Shadow's unprecedented behavior and the knowledge that these were his final hours with their family created an emotional storm that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Part of her wanted to follow the bobcat, to trust the instincts that had initially made her believe in his protective nature. But Dr. Whitman's warnings echoed in her mind, reinforced by Eleanor's practical wisdom and her own maternal fears. "I can't take much more of this," Sarah confessed, slumping against the nursery wall. "If he keeps this up all night, I'm going to have a complete breakdown." Tom's own exhaustion was evident in the way his shoulders sagged with defeat. The past month had aged him years, carving new lines around his eyes and stealing the easy confidence that had once characterized his interactions with wildlife. Shadow's behavior tonight felt like a final test of his faith, and he was failing miserably. At 4:30 a.m., Shadow's tactics changed dramatically. Instead of trying to lead them away from the nursery, he began exhibiting behavior that looked disturbingly like the protective postures Dr. Whitman had warned them about. He positioned himself directly between the family and the hallway, his body tense and alert, facing away from Emma's crib toward some perceived threat they couldn't identify. "Now he's guarding," Eleanor observed with grim satisfaction, just like Dr. Whitman predicted. "The animal's territorial instincts are taking over completely." But Tom noticed something odd about Shadow's positioning. The bobcat wasn't facing the crib or showing any interest in Emma at all. Instead, his attention was focused entirely on the area beyond the nursery, as if he were protecting the baby from something coming from the rest of the house. "Eleanor, look at where he's facing," Tom said quietly. "He's not guarding Emma from us. He's guarding all of us from something else." "Don't read meanings into animal behavior that aren't there," Eleanor replied, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "You're looking for reasons to justify keeping him, and that's exactly the kind of emotional thinking that gets families hurt." As dawn approached, Shadow's agitation reached a crescendo that none of them had witnessed before. His cries took on a keening quality that raised the hair on the back of Sarah's neck, a sound that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to some primitive part of her brain that recognized mortal danger. At 5:45 a.m., just as the first pale light began filtering through the bedroom window, Shadow made one final desperate attempt to communicate. He approached Tom directly, looked him in the eyes with an intensity that was almost human, then walked deliberately toward the hallway. When Tom didn't follow, Shadow returned and repeated the action, his golden eyes never leaving Tom's face. "He's trying to show us something," Tom said with sudden conviction. "I've worked with animals my entire adult life, and I've never seen behavior like this. He's not being territorial or aggressive. He's trying to warn us about something specific." Eleanor's patience finally snapped. "Thomas Mitchell, you listen to me right now. In 3 hours, that transport truck is going to arrive, and that animal is leaving this house whether you understand his behavior or not. Dr. Whitman has 30 years of expertise, and she's told us exactly what we're dealing with." At 6:15 a.m., as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of a day that would change everything, Shadow made one last attempt to save them all. He approached the 3 adults standing in the nursery doorway, looked each of them in the eye with desperate intelligence, then walked slowly toward the hallway. This time, instead of stopping to see if they would follow, he disappeared into the darkness beyond, his cries echoing through the house like a warning that time was running out. At 7 o'clock a.m., as the first golden rays of sunrise streamed through the kitchen windows, Tom received the phone call that would shatter what remained of their fragile hope. Dr. Whitman's voice carried an edge of professional excitement that made his stomach clench with dread. "Mr. Mitchell, I have excellent news," she announced, her tone suggesting that excellent was a matter of perspective. "The sanctuary has agreed to take Shadow immediately." and they're particularly interested in his case for a behavioral study they're conducting on territorial aggression in rescued bobcats. This could provide valuable data for preventing similar situations in the future. The words hit Tom like physical blows. Shadow wasn't just being relocated. He was becoming a research subject, a case study in failed domestic integration. The bobcat who had chosen their family, who had grieved with them through miscarriages and celebrated Emma's birth, would spend his remaining years in clinical observation, his every behavior catalogued as evidence of his inherent dangerousness. Additionally, Dr. Whitman continued, I've been contacted by a documentary crew from Animal Planet. They're interested in filming Shadow's intake process and rehabilitation as part of a series on exotic pet ownership gone wrong. The exposure could help other families avoid similar mistakes. Sarah, who had been listening from across the kitchen, felt her knees buckle. She gripped the counter for support as the full implications of Dr. Whitman's words sank in. Their private tragedy was about to become public entertainment, their love for Shadow twisted into a cautionary tale about the foolishness of trusting wild animals. I don't consent to any filming, Tom said through gritted teeth, his knuckles white as he clutched the phone. Of course, that's entirely your choice, Dr. Whitman replied smoothly. But I should mention that the documentary would likely include interviews with other families who've experienced similar situations. The educational value could be tremendous. The transport truck arrived at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes early, as if the universe were eager to complete their family's destruction ahead of schedule. Sarah watched through the window as two men in khaki uniforms unloaded a large metal crate from the back of the vehicle. The cage looked industrial and impersonal, designed for containing dangerous cargo rather than transporting a beloved family member. Eleanor, who had been unusually quiet since their pre-dawn argument, suddenly spoke from her position at the kitchen table. "That cage is awfully small," she observed, her voice carrying an unexpected note of doubt. "It's standard transport size for medium-sized wildcats," Dr. Whitman explained, having arrived shortly after the truck. "Shadow will only be in there for 6 hours. The sanctuary's permanent enclosures are much more spacious." But Eleanor's comment had planted a seed of uncertainty that grew rapidly in the morning light. Tom found himself studying the transport team's equipment with the critical eye of a wildlife professional, and what he saw troubled him deeply. The cage was indeed smaller than regulations typically required for bobcat transport. The sedation equipment looked outdated, and one of the handlers bore fresh scratches on his arms that suggested recent difficulties with other animals. "How many transports has your team completed this month?" Tom asked, his conservation officer instincts finally overriding his emotional exhaustion. The lead handler, a thin man with nervous eyes, exchanged glances with his partner before answering. "This would be our, fourth bobcat transport this year." "This year?" Tom's voice sharpened. "It's only March." "That seems like an unusual number of behavioral relocations." Dr. Whitman stepped in quickly. "The increase in exotic pet surrenders has been quite significant lately. More families are recognizing when situations become untenable." But Tom's professional experience suggested a different explanation. 4 bobcat behavioral transfers in 3 months pointed to either an epidemic of poor pet ownership or problems with the assessment process itself. He began to wonder how many other families had been convinced to surrender beloved animals based on similar expert recommendations. The sedation process proved more traumatic than anyone had anticipated. Shadow, who had never shown fear of humans, seemed to sense the finality of what was happening. When the veterinarian Dr. Whitman had brought along approached with the sedative, Shadow retreated to the corner of his enclosure, his golden eyes wide with betrayal. "This is normal, Doctor." Whitman assured them as Shadow's distressed cries echoed through the morning air. Animals often resist when they sense environmental changes. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's behavior reflected something deeper than simple resistance to change. The bobcat's cries had a heartbroken quality that seemed to speak directly to the part of her that had first fallen in love with the tiny kitten Tom had brought home 3 years ago. Emma, as if sensing the family's distress, began crying inconsolably. Nothing Sarah tried could calm her daughter, not feeding, not rocking, not the soft lullabies that usually soothed her. The baby's cries seemed to echo Shadow's own distress, creating a symphony of anguish that made rational thought nearly impossible. "The baby's picking up on your emotional state," Dr. Whitman observed clinically. "Children are very sensitive to parental stress. Once the bobcat is removed and your household returns to normal, Emma's behavior should stabilize as well." The words stung because they implied that Tom and Sarah's attachment to Shadow was selfish, that their grief was somehow harmful to their daughter. But as Tom watched Shadow pace frantically in his enclosure, he couldn't help wondering if they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. The final blow came when Eleanor, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing discomfort, suddenly stepped forward. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "I want to know more about this sanctuary. What exactly happens to animals with behavioral issues?" Dr. Whitman's answer was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. The sanctuary specialized in rehabilitation through controlled behavioral modification, which included environmental enrichment protocols and systematic desensitization therapy. The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality that Shadow would spend his life in carefully managed isolation, his every interaction monitored and controlled. "And if the rehabilitation isn't successful?" Eleanor pressed, her grandmother's instincts finally overriding her practical concerns. "The sanctuary has an excellent track record," Dr. Whitman replied evasively. "They're very committed to giving each animal the best possible outcome." The euphemistic language sent chills down Tom's spine. He had worked in wildlife conservation long enough to understand what best possible outcome meant when applied to animals deemed permanently unsuitable for release or adoption. Shadow's life might be measured not in years but in the duration of his usefulness as a research subject. At 8:15 a.m., as the sedative began to take effect and Shadow's struggles grew weaker, Sarah experienced a moment of clarity that cut through weeks of exhaustion and confusion. She was watching the chemical erasure of consciousness in an animal who had never hurt anyone, never shown aggression toward their child, never demonstrated anything but love and loyalty to their family. "Stop," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above Emma's continued crying. "I'm sorry?" Dr. Whitman looked up from her clipboard, her pen poised over what appeared to be final transfer documents. "I said stop!" Sarah's voice grew stronger, fueled by a maternal instinct that had nothing to do with protecting Emma and everything to do with protecting the innocent. "Don't sedate him anymore. I want to think about this." Tom felt a surge of hope so powerful it made him dizzy. "Sarah, are you sure?" Before she could answer, Dr. Whitman intervened with the full weight of her professional authority. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand this is emotional, but we've already discussed the dangers extensively. The transport team has a schedule to maintain, and delaying this process will only make it more traumatic for everyone involved." The pressure was enormous. Financial, social, professional, and emotional forces all aligned against their resistance. But as Sarah looked at Shadow's sedated form, his golden eyes still holding a flicker of awareness and trust, she realized that some decisions couldn't be made with spreadsheets and expert opinions. Some choices required faith in love over fear, trust over safety, hope over the crushing weight of practical wisdom. The tragedy wasn't that Shadow might hurt Emma. The tragedy was that they were about to destroy their family to save it, sacrificing love for the illusion of security, choosing the certainty of loss over the possibility of understanding. As the morning sun climbed higher and the transport team grew impatient, the Mitchell family stood on the precipice of a decision that would define them forever. The moment of revelation came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet desperation of a man who had run out of rational explanations. At 8:30 a.m., as Shadow lay semi-conscious in the transport crate and the handlers grew increasingly impatient about their schedule, Tom made a decision that would either vindicate 3 years of trust or confirm his complete failure as a father and husband. "I'm following him," Tom announced suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning tension like a blade. "Before we load that crate, I'm going to see what Shadow was trying to show us." Dr. Whitman's reaction was immediate and sharp. "Mr. Mitchell, that is absolutely not advisable. The animal is sedated but not fully unconscious. Any disruption to the transport process could result in dangerous disorientation and potential aggression." But Tom was already moving, driven by an instinct that had served him well throughout his career in wildlife conservation. He had learned to trust the subtle communications of animals, to read the messages hidden in behavior that seemed meaningless to untrained observers. Shadow's frantic attempts to lead them somewhere specific had been too persistent, too purposeful to dismiss as mere stress. Eleanor grabbed his arm as he passed. "Thomas, don't do this. You're going to regret it for the rest of your life if something happens to Emma because you followed a wild animal's whims." "Mom," Tom said gently, covering her weathered hand with his own, "I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life if I don't." Sarah, still holding the crying Emma, made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm going with you," she declared, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "If Shadow was trying to protect Emma from something, I need to know what it was." The procession that followed was both absurd and profound. A conservation officer, an exhausted new mother carrying her infant, and a skeptical grandmother following the path that a sedated bobcat had tried desperately to show them just hours before. Dr. Whitman and the transport team trailed behind, the behaviorist's professional composure cracking as her carefully orchestrated removal process devolved into what she clearly considered dangerous amateur psychology. Shadow's intended route became clear as they moved through the house. His frantic pacing had led toward the basement stairs, an area of the cabin that the family rarely used except for storage and the utility systems. Tom flicked on the overhead light, illuminating the wooden steps that descended into the foundation level of their mountain home. "This is where he wanted us to go," Tom said with growing certainty. "Every time he tried to lead us away from the nursery, this is the direction he was heading." The basement was cool and dimly lit, filled with the accumulated possessions of 3 years of mountain living, holiday decorations, camping equipment, Emma's future baby clothes in carefully labeled boxes. But as they descended the stairs, a subtle smell began to register in Tom's consciousness, something that didn't belong in the familiar environment of their storage space. Eleanor noticed it first, her face wrinkling with concern. "What's that smell? Smells like—" She paused, her expression shifting from skepticism to alarm. "Tom, that smells like gas." The words galvanized Tom into action. As a conservation officer, he had responded to numerous household emergencies involving propane leaks, natural gas problems, and carbon monoxide poisoning. The faint but distinctive odor that grew stronger as they moved deeper into the basement was unmistakably the scent of propane, the fuel that powered their heating system and water heater. "Everyone out," Tom commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly how dangerous their situation had become. "Now, don't run, but move quickly, and don't touch any electrical switches." Dr. Whitman, who had been preparing to lecture them about the foolishness of following animal instincts, suddenly found herself part of an emergency evacuation. The transport team, recognizing the shift from behavioral consultation to potential disaster response, began moving their equipment away from the house with professional efficiency. In the safety of the front yard, Tom used his cell phone to call the county's emergency gas service, explaining the situation with the calm precision of someone trained in crisis management. Within 20 minutes, a team of technicians arrived with specialized detection equipment, their expressions growing increasingly grave as they traced the source of the leak. The problem, they discovered, was both simple and potentially catastrophic. The propane line feeding the basement heating system had developed a slow leak at a connection joint, a failure so gradual that it had gone undetected by the household's standard safety equipment. The leak was positioned in such a way that gas accumulated in the basement during certain weather conditions, particularly on calm nights when natural ventilation was minimal. "This is about as serious as it gets," the lead technician explained to the gathered family. "The concentration isn't quite at explosive levels yet, but it's getting close. Another few days of accumulation, and you could have had a major incident from something as simple as the furnace cycling on." Sarah felt her legs give out as the implications sank in. She sank onto the porch steps, Emma still in her arms as she realized how close they had come to losing everything. The propane concentration was highest during the early morning hours, precisely when Shadow had been trying to wake them. The bobcat's sensitive nose had detected the growing danger weeks before it became noticeable to human senses. Eleanor, her face pale with shock and dawning understanding, approached the transport crate where Shadow lay in sedated confusion. The proud woman who had argued so forcefully for his removal now looked at the bobcat with something approaching awe. "He was trying to save us," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "For 30 nights, he was trying to warn us about the gas, and we thought he was threatening Emma." Dr. Whitman's response to this revelation was telling in its defensiveness. Rather than acknowledging the obvious explanation for Shadow's behavior, she immediately began constructing alternative theories that would preserve her professional assessment. "While it's possible the animal detected some environmental change," she said carefully, "we can't definitively conclude that his behavior was specifically related to the gas leak. Correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation, and territorial aggression can manifest in many ways." But Tom was no longer listening to the expert's explanations. He was kneeling beside Shadow's crate, watching as the sedative began to wear off and the bobcat's golden eyes regained their focus. When Shadow saw Tom's face, he made a soft chirping sound, the same maternal vocalization he had used when Emma was first brought home from the hospital. "I'm sorry, buddy," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I didn't understand." "You were trying to save us, and I almost sent you away." The gas technicians worked for another 2 hours, shutting off the propane system and ventilating the basement before beginning repairs on the faulty connection. Their presence attracted curious neighbors, and word of the near disaster spread quickly through their small mountain community. By afternoon, the same neighbors who had complained about Shadow's nightly vocalizations were stopping by to express their amazement at the bobcat's life-saving intervention. Sheriff Coleman arrived as the repair work was being completed, his earlier official concern transformed into professional admiration. "Tom," he said, shaking his head in wonder, "if that cat hadn't raised such a ruckus, we might have been dealing with a tragedy instead of a rescue story." The revelation forced a complete reevaluation of everything they thought they knew about Shadow's behavior. His precise timing, his specific focus on leading them away from the nursery toward the basement, his increasing desperation as the gas concentration grew more dangerous. Every detail that Dr. Whitman had interpreted as territorial aggression was actually evidence of protective intelligence. As evening approached and Shadow fully recovered from the sedation, he displayed none of the anxiety or agitation that had characterized his behavior for the past month. Instead, he moved through the house with his old peaceful confidence, occasionally checking on Emma, but showing no signs of the frantic urgency that had driven his nightly warnings. The transport team had long since departed, their services no longer needed. Dr. Whitman left with considerably less professional satisfaction than she had arrived with, her carefully researched behavioral assessment invalidated by the simple reality that sometimes animals know things that experts don't. That night, for the first time in 31 days, Shadow did not wake the family at 3:17 a.m. He slept peacefully beside Emma's crib, his presence a comfort rather than a source of anxiety, his golden eyes occasionally opening to check on his charges before closing again in contentment. The truth had not only freed Shadow from false accusations, it had revealed the depth of devotion that motivated his seemingly destructive behavior. He had been willing to endure weeks of misunderstanding, to risk his place in the family he loved, to persist in warnings that no one comprehended, all in service of protecting the humans who meant everything to him. 6 months later, on a crisp September morning that painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and scarlet, Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window watching Shadow and Emma play together in the sunlit yard. The scene that unfolded before her would have been impossible to imagine during those dark February nights when their family had teetered on the edge of destruction. Emma, now 10 months old and confidently crawling, explored the fallen autumn leaves with the fearless curiosity of a child who had never known danger. Shadow maintained his protective vigil from a respectful distance, his golden eyes tracking every movement while his body language spoke of contentment rather than anxiety. When Emma squealed with delight at discovering a particularly colorful maple leaf, Shadow's purr was audible even through the kitchen window. The transformation in their lives had been nothing short of miraculous. The propane system had been completely rebuilt with multiple safety redundancies, including state-of-the-art gas detection equipment that would alert them to even the smallest leak. But more importantly, their understanding of Shadow's intelligence and devotion had fundamentally changed how they viewed the relationship between humans and animals. Tom emerged from his morning shower, his hair still damp and his face bearing the relaxed expression of a man who had finally learned to sleep through the night again. His job performance had returned to its previous high standards, earning him a commendation from the State Wildlife Department for his innovative approaches to human-animal conflict resolution. The irony that his own family crisis had become a professional asset was not lost on him. "Dr. Martinez called," Sarah announced, referring to her former supervisor at the regional hospital. "She wants me to consider heading up their new pediatric emergency preparedness program." Apparently, our story has gotten some attention in medical circles. The story had indeed traveled far beyond their mountain community. News outlets from across the country had picked up the tale of the Bobcat who saved his family from gas poisoning, transforming what Dr. Whitman had intended as a cautionary tale about exotic pet ownership into an inspiring example of interspecies communication and trust. Sarah had returned to nursing 3 months earlier, her confidence restored and her perspective broadened by their ordeal. She found herself particularly drawn to cases involving children whose symptoms were initially puzzling, remembering how easily Shadow's protective behavior had been misinterpreted as aggression. Her colleagues had begun consulting her on cases where environmental factors might be contributing to mysterious illnesses. Eleanor's transformation had been the most dramatic of all. Tom's mother, who had once argued passionately for Shadow's removal, had become the Bobcat's most devoted advocate. She spent 2 days each week at the cabin, helping with Emma's care and forming an unlikely friendship with the animal she had once considered dangerous. "I was so convinced I knew what was best," Eleanor confessed to Sarah as they watched Shadow gently nose a leaf toward Emma's reaching hands. 70 years of life experience, and I still had to learn that wisdom isn't the same as knowledge. That cat taught an old woman some humility. The reconciliation between Eleanor and Shadow had taken months to develop. Initially, the Bobcat had remained wary of the woman who had advocated for his exile, but Eleanor's patient efforts to earn his trust had eventually succeeded. Now, Shadow would often seek out her company, seeming to understand that her fierce protectiveness of Emma came from the same love that motivated his own vigilance. Dr. Whitman's professional reputation had suffered considerably following the revelation about the gas leak. An investigation by the university's ethics board had discovered a pattern of hasty assessments and predetermined conclusions in several of her exotic pet cases. While she retained her position, her consulting practice had virtually disappeared, and her planned documentary about dangerous pet ownership had been quietly shelved. I heard Dr. Whitman is focusing more on research than field consultations these days, Tom mentioned, reading from a professional newsletter. Probably for the best. Sometimes academic theory and real-world experience don't align as neatly as experts would like to believe. The case had attracted attention from animal behaviorists worldwide, many of whom wanted to study Shadow's remarkable sensory abilities and protective instincts. Tom had politely declined most research requests, unwilling to subject Shadow to the clinical scrutiny that had nearly destroyed their family. However, he had agreed to participate in a long-term study conducted by researchers at North Carolina State University who were investigating the potential for trained animals to detect household hazards. The preliminary results are fascinating. Dr. Jennifer Chen, the lead researcher, had explained during her most recent visit. Shadow's sensitivity to gas concentrations is approximately 6 times greater than our most sophisticated detection equipment. If we could understand how he processes these chemical signals, we might be able to develop early warning systems that could save thousands of lives. The financial strain that had nearly broken them during February had been replaced by unexpected opportunities. Tom's expertise in human-animal relationships had led to consulting contracts with other families facing similar challenges. Sarah's story had been featured in several nursing journals, leading to speaking engagements about environmental health hazards in domestic settings. Emma's development had proceeded normally, showing no ill effects from her brief exposure to propane fumes or the stress of her parents' ordeal. If anything, her bond with Shadow seemed to have given her an unusual confidence around animals and an early sensitivity to their moods and needs. Pediatric specialists who had examined her noted her advanced social awareness and her remarkable ability to communicate nonverbally with Shadow. "She understands him in ways that we're still learning," Sarah observed, watching as Emma crawled purposefully toward Shadow when she needed comfort. "Sometimes I think they have their own language that doesn't require words." The anniversary of their near disaster had been marked by a community celebration in their honor. The local newspaper had run a feature story titled "Guardian Angel in Fur," and the mayor had declared February 15th as Animal Awareness Day in their county. Shadow bore the attention with typical feline dignity, seeming to understand that he had become something of a local celebrity. Sheriff Coleman had become a regular visitor, often stopping by to check on the family and to seek Tom's advice on animal-related emergencies. "That cat of yours has changed how we approach these situations," he admitted. "We're a lot more careful about dismissing animal behavior that seems strange but persistent." The cabin itself had been transformed into a model of environmental safety. In addition to the upgraded propane system, they had installed comprehensive air quality monitoring, backup power systems, and emergency communication equipment. Wildlife officials now used their home as an example of how families with exotic pets could maintain both safety and genuine interspecies relationships. As autumn deepened into winter, the family settled into rhythms that would have seemed impossible during those desperate February nights. Emma's bedtime routine now included a gentle goodnight ritual with Shadow, who would touch his nose to her hand before settling into his chosen spot beside her crib. Tom and Sarah's evening conversations often included Shadow, who seemed to follow their discussions with intelligent attention. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had gone through with the transport?" Sarah asked one evening as they watched the first snow of the season dust the mountain peaks. Tom considered the question seriously before responding. "I try not to think about it too much, but I know we would have lost more than just Shadow. We would have lost our ability to trust our instincts, to believe that love and patience can solve problems that experts can't." The story of Shadow's heroism had rippled outward in ways they never could have anticipated, inspiring other families to look more carefully at their pets' behavior and encouraging animal welfare organizations to reconsider their approaches to behavioral assessments. Several families had contacted them to share similar stories of animals whose seemingly problematic behavior had actually been attempts to communicate important information. On this particular September morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast and Tom reviewed the day's work schedule, their lives embodied a truth that couldn't be quantified in research papers or professional assessments. Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the willingness to trust love over fear, to believe that intelligence takes many forms, and to remember that the most important voices are often the ones that can't speak in words. Shadow's golden eyes caught the morning light as he supervised Emma's leaf exploration, his presence a daily reminder that protection doesn't always look like protection, that love doesn't always feel like love, and that sometimes saving a family requires the courage to be misunderstood until the truth finally comes to light. The story that had begun with desperate nights and impossible choices had evolved into something larger, a testament to the bonds that connect all living beings and the wisdom that emerges when we learn to listen with more than just our ears. Dear friends, this story of Shadow the Bobcat reminds us of life's most precious truth, that love often wears disguises we don't recognize at first glance. How many times have we dismissed the difficult moments, the sleepless nights, the persistent voices trying to warn us, only to discover later they were gifts in disguise? Shadow's 30 nights of disruption saved his family's lives, just as our own challenging seasons often carry hidden blessings we can't see until time reveals their purpose. As grandparents and seasoned souls, we've learned that wisdom isn't always found in expert opinions or popular advice, but in trusting our hearts and paying attention to those who love us most, even when they can't speak our language. Sometimes the greatest protection comes from the most unexpected sources, and the deepest loyalty is shown through actions that look like problems until we understand their true meaning. Shadow's story teaches us that love persists through misunderstanding, that devotion doesn't give up when it's not appreciated, and that sometimes saving someone means being willing to be the difficult one until the truth comes to light. In our golden years, may we remember to listen with our hearts, trust our instincts, and never underestimate the power of unconditional love to see what others cannot. Share your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a time when someone's difficult behavior turned out to be their way of protecting or helping you? What animal companion has taught you an important life lesson? Please share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has surprised you in unexpected ways.